masked ball. There was a long-standing feud between the houses of Montague and Capulet, two of the noblest families of ancient Italy, and the narrow streets of Verona rang constantly with the sound of brawl and strife. The enmity between the heads of the family and their noble kinsmen descended, of course, to their retainers, and the servants of both houses never met without quarrel and frequent bloodshed. The Prince of Verona vainly tried to stop this incessant bickering. Again and again it burst out with renewed fury. 3 serious outbreaks had already occurred in the city, when not only the servants of the families, but even respectable citizens had joined in the fray, and became, for the moment, furious partisans of one side or the other. Finally, the prince, enraged by another of these skirmishes, started by the servants, but joined in afterwards by the heads of the houses themselves, pronounced sentence indignantly on Montague and Capulet. If ever they disturbed the streets again, he declared, their lives should pay the forfeit of the peace. When the rioters had dispersed and the prince had retired, Lady Montague began to make anxious inquiry about her son, saying how glad she was that he had not been in the fray. Her nephew Benvolio replied that an hour before dawn, driven to walk abroad by a troubled mind, he had seen young Romeo walking in a grove of sycamore outside the city, but that as soon as Romeo became aware of his approach, he stole away into the covert of the wood. To this Montague added that his son had been seen there many mornings, evidently in deep sorrow, and that when he was in the house he penned himself up in his own room, shut up his windows, locked out the fair daylight, and made an artificial night for himself. Montague neither knew the cause of this strange behavior, nor could he learn it of him, though both he and his friends had earnestly entreated Romeo to tell them the cause of his grief. At this moment the young man himself came in sight, and Benvolio hastily begged his uncle and Lady Montague to step aside, saying that he would certainly find out what was the matter. Perhaps Benvolio used more tact in dealing with his cousin, or perhaps Romeo was at last not sorry to confide his trouble. At any rate, he confessed to Benvolio that the reason of his unhappiness was that he was in love with a beautiful lady called Rosalind, who was very cold and indifferent, and did not in the least return his affection. As there seemed no hope of Romeo's winning the lady, Benvolio very sensibly advised him to think no more about her, but to try to find someone else equally beautiful and charming. Romeo replied that this was quite impossible, but Benvolio did not at all despair of effecting his cure. And, as it happened, the very remedy suggested was successful, and that within the next few hours. This was how it came about. The rival house of Capulet, like that of Montague, boasted of but one child, but while the Montagues was a son, Romeo, the Capulets' only surviving offspring was a daughter, a lovely young girl called Juliet. Up to the present, Juliet had been too youthful to take part in the gaieties of the world, but a certain noble young count called Paris, a kinsman of the Prince of Verona, had already been attracted by her charms, and now begged permission from her father to pay his suit to her. Capulet replied that Juliet was very young still to think of marriage, but that if Paris liked to try to win her heart, and succeeded in doing so, he would willingly add his consent to hers. Further, he said that he was holding that night an old accustomed feast, to which he had invited a number of guests, including many beautiful maidens. Among them Paris would behold his daughter, and he could then compare her with others, and judge whether she still surpassed them as he now thought. He was to see all, hear all, and to like her the best whose merit should be the most. The servant sent out by Capulet to carry his invitations was no scholar, and happening to meet Romeo and Benvolio, he appealed to them to read over to him the list of invited guests. Among the names written there, Romeo found that of Rosalind, with other admired beauties of Verona, and Benvolio advised him to go to the ball, and without prejudice to compare her face with some of the other ladies present, when he would find that, after all, she was no such paragon. Romeo replied that he would go, not for this reason, but to delight in the splendour of his own lady. Even although it was to an enemy's house he was going, and he was placing himself in grave peril if his identity were discovered, it was not a difficult matter for Romeo to gain admittance to the Capulets, for all the guests were to go in fancy dress and wear masks. Romeo chose the disguise of a pilgrim. When the night came, he was still sad at heart, and declared he would join in no dancing. He had a soul of lead that bore him to the ground, so that he could hardly move. Besides Benvolio, on this night Romeo had with him another friend, a very light-hearted, witty gentleman called Mercutio, a kinsman of the Prince of Verona. As they went along, Mercutio tried to laugh Romeo out of his melancholy mood, and to chase away his sadness with his gay chatter. But nothing he could say served to cheer up Romeo. A dark misgiving seemed to hang over him, and it was with no festive spirit that he entered the brilliantly lighted hall of Capulet's house. All here was splendor and gaiety. Crowds of quaintly dressed figures wandered to and fro. Capulet himself, with his daughter Juliet and others of his house, received the guests and gave them a hearty welcome. Then the music began, and the dancers grouped themselves for the stately and graceful measures of those days. Romeo was late in arriving, and the dancing had already begun when he entered the hall. He stood for a while looking on at the scene. His Rosalind, no doubt, was there, among other proud beauties of Verona, but tonight her sway was to be broken forever. For there among the dancers was one who far surpassed her fellows, even as a snowy dove trooping with crows. In the dazzling radiance of her first youthful bloom moved the daughter of the house, and when he saw this slender maiden with her peerless beauty and her locks of shining gold, all lesser feelings melted out of Romeo's heart, and he knew he had never really loved till now. Romeo's half-uttered exclamations of rapture were overheard by a nephew of Lady Capulet's, a fiery nobleman called Tybalt, always ready for brawls and quarrelling. "This, by his voice, should be a Montague," he said, and immediately ordered his page to fetch his rapier. "How dares the slave come hither, covered with an antic face, to fleer in scorn at our solemnity? Now, by the honour of my kin, I would hold it no sin to strike him dead." "Why, how now, kinsman? Why do you storm so?" asked Capulet. "Uncle, this is a Montague, our foe, a villain who has come here in spite to scorn at our solemnity." "Young Romeo, is it? It is he, that villain Romeo." "Content you, gentle cousin, let him alone," said Capulet. "He bears himself like a gallant gentleman, and to say truth, Verona boasts him to be a virtuous and well-governed youth. I would not for the wealth of all the town do him any wrong here in my house. Therefore be patient, take no notice of him. It is my will, and if you respect him, show an amiable face, and put off those frowns, which are not a pleasing expression at a feast." "It fits when such a villain is a guest," said Tybalt sullenly. "I'll not endure him." "He shall be endured," said Capulet sternly. "What, good man, boy? I say he shall. Go to. Am I the master here, or you? Go to. You'll not endure him. You'll make a mutiny among my guests. You'll be the man." "Why, uncle, it's a shame," persisted Tybalt. "Go to. Go to," cried the exasperated old man. "You are a saucy boy. Go. Be quiet, or more light, I'll make you quiet." Burning with wrath against Romeo, and furious at the rebuke which his presumption had won from his uncle, Tybalt withdrew, silenced for the moment, but his heart filled with the bitterest spite, and determining to be revenged at the first opportunity for the humiliation he had suffered. In the meanwhile the dance was ended, and Romeo had been able to approach Juliet. In his role of a pilgrim he carried on with her a half-jesting conversation which barely veiled the deep devotion he was already beginning to feel, and, according to the customs of those days, he was even permitted to salute the lady with a courteous kiss. Their conversation was interrupted by Juliet's nurse, who came to summon Juliet to her mother, and then Romeo learnt for the first time that the young girl who had so enchanted him was the daughter of the house, a Capulet, the child of his foe. And a few minutes later, Juliet, also making eager inquiry about the young guest in the guise of a pilgrim, heard that his name was Romeo, a Montague, the only son of the great enemy of her father's house.